The town of Flaxborough began its mornings not with bells or bustle, but with the discreet cough of the postman. By 8 o'clock, his bicycle could be heard ticking up the high street, its saddle squeaking faintly like an old man's joints. Behind curtains and lace pelmets, housewives and clerks alike awaited the soft thud of envelopes through letter slots, that modest punctuation to the day's monotony. Miss Edna Roper was among those who preferred to collect their post in privacy. She occupied a narrow bed-sitting room above a draper's shop, where the smell of starch and camphor seeped into everything, even her dreams. Her one indulgence was punctuality. By 8:30, she would be in the borough council offices, key already in hand, coat neatly folded across her arm, hatpin aligned as though it had been inspected by the Almighty. It was on one such morning, a Thursday of no particular distinction, that Miss Roper arrived earlier than usual. The winter sky outside remained in the uncertain grey between night and day, and the echo of her footsteps down the council corridor seemed uncomfortably loud. She let herself into the typing room, set her handbag precisely on the desk, and drew from it a small bundle of envelopes tied with string. For a moment she hesitated. The clock above the filing cabinet ticked in a manner that suggested disapproval. After a brief sigh, she untied the string and placed 3 of the envelopes into the outgoing mail tray. None bore stamps. Each was addressed in her tidy, utilitarian hand. Then, without looking again, she switched on the electric fire and began to type a report on the condition of public conveniences, paragraphing with immaculate propriety. At 8:30, Mrs. Swithenbank, the cleaner, entered with her bucket and an enthusiasm untempered by age. She paused to observe the typist. "You're early this morning, Miss Roper." "I find one accomplishes more when unobserved," replied Miss Roper, her eyes on the paper. Mrs. Swithenbank chuckled in a manner that managed to sound both friendly and reproachful. "Ah, well, it's the quiet ones, they say." Miss Roper smiled faintly, an ambiguous expression that could have meant anything from agreement to moral disgust. By mid-morning, the town's mail had accomplished what the local press seldom did. It stirred the imagination. The first to open his envelope was Councillor Hargood, chairman of the Amenities Committee, a man whose resemblance to a well-fed walrus had never troubled his self-esteem. He read the letter once, then twice, each time with growing incredulity. The content was not obscene, merely pointed. It implied, by the graceful use of italics, that his enthusiasm for civic improvement extended rather too intimately toward the secretary of the Floral Society. The phrasing was correct, almost judicial, and signed only "a concerned townsman." By 11, Councillor Hargood had shown the letter to 3 colleagues, and his wife, who, after a moment's delicate hesitation, had declared the handwriting too neat for a man. Inspector Purbright first heard of the matter when Sergeant Love appeared in his doorway, carrying a folder he handled as though it might explode. "Anonymous correspondence, sir," Love announced. "Several complaints already this morning. They're of a, personal nature." Purbright looked up from his newspaper. "Personal in the anatomical or municipal sense, Love?" "Both, sir, though expressed with remarkable decorum." Purbright sighed. He had encountered most varieties of crime in his time, but few so socially inconvenient as libel conducted by typewriter. "Very well, let's take a look." Love produced a single sheet of green-tinted paper. The type was even, almost fastidious, to the esteemed councillor Hargood. There are certain alliances within the council which may cause discomfort when brought into clearer view. It would be prudent, perhaps, to moderate your attentions where the public eye might reasonably suspect partiality. Yours, in civic sincerity, a concerned townsman. Purbright folded the letter carefully. "We must be grateful," he said, that our anonymous moralist is not afflicted with illiteracy. Love grinned. There's been another, sir, to the mayor himself. Something about misuse of council stationery. That, said Purbright, I consider a personal insult. Stationery offences are our department. By luncheon, the matter had spread like jam through a parish tea. Each councillor, it seemed, had received a letter of his or her own, each couched in similarly chaste but corrosive tones. The content varied, yet the style remained constant, polite, reasonable, and informed by a knowledge of municipal gossip too precise to be guessed. The mayoress, Mrs. Glossop, whose sense of dignity could have intimidated a cathedral, called an emergency meeting of the Town Amenities Committee. Purbright attended at her invitation, or rather her command, taking care to appear mildly inconvenienced but never amused. They assembled in the council chamber where the portraits of former mayors looked down with the weary tolerance of the long dead. I have never, declared Mrs. Glossop, in my experience of public life, encountered such gross discourtesy. It is a vulgar intrusion into private virtue. Councillor Hargood cleared his throat. Indeed, Madam Mayoress, and to direct it toward persons of unimpeachable integrity, well, it's actionable. The town clerk, Mr. Pemble, who had not yet received a letter and therefore felt unusually moral, proposed that all copies be surrendered to the police. I'm afraid, Purbright interjected gently, that without handwriting, fingerprints, or unguarded confession, our scope for prosecution is limited to prayer. There followed an uneasy silence, broken only by the muffled ticking of the chamber clock. At length, Mrs. Glossop said, "Then at least let us agree to treat the matter with discretion." A statement which, as Purbright noted inwardly, would ensure precisely the opposite. When the meeting dispersed, Purbright lingered behind. Through the frosted window of the typing room, he could just make out the silhouette of Miss Roper, seated with impeccable posture, her hands poised above the keys. There was something about her stillness, an air of quiet self-possession, that resisted the gossip attaching itself to others. He entered softly. "Miss Roper," he began, "I understand you manage most of the council's correspondence?" "Yes, Inspector. I type the minutes, memoranda, and official replies." Her tone was calm, not defensive. "You must find it interesting, being privy to so many private discussions." Her fingers paused above the typewriter. "I consider discretion a professional duty." Purbright smiled faintly. "A rare quality these days." She looked up then, meeting his gaze without flinching. Her eyes were the cool grey of morning mist, her expression unreadable. "It is perhaps undervalued," she said. He thanked her, made a note of nothing in particular, and withdrew. Outside, the winter sun had achieved little more than a pallid shimmer across the rooftops. Purbright walked slowly toward the police station, his thoughts occupied less with guilt than with motivation. Anonymous letters, he knew, were seldom acts of malice alone. More often they were appeals for recognition, written by those too timid for confrontation, yet too aggrieved for silence. In Flaxborough, where politeness functioned as a civic narcotic, anonymity could be the only form of honesty left. He lit a cigarette, then regretted it immediately. The taste of municipal scandal was acrid enough without assistance. That evening, Sergeant Love returned from a second round of interviews. "3 more letters, sir," he reported. "All on the same green paper, same typewriter too, most likely." "Indeed." "Yes, sir. One addressed to the vicar's wife, suggesting impropriety in the flower arrangements, and another to the librarian, accusing her of suppressing morally instructive literature." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "A moral reformer, then, possibly religious, certainly observant." Love hesitated. They all came through the internal council post, sir. Hand-delivered, not posted. Purbright exhaled slowly. Then our reformer is not only observant but employed. He turned to the window, watching the street lamps flicker into life. Somewhere beyond them lay a typist's room, tidy to the point of virtue, where a woman might already be planning her next paragraph of civic improvement. "Love," he said, "I believe we shall need to examine the council's typing pool tomorrow morning. With tact." "Yes, sir." "And love." "Sir?" "Bring lavender oil. I suspect it lingers on the stationery." The inspector remained by the window long after his sergeant had gone. From the square below rose the faint rattle of a bicycle, perhaps the postman again, or perhaps someone else entirely. Purbright's thoughts moved with the slow, courteous rhythm that Flaxborough demanded. Whoever had written the letters, they had done so not to destroy but to disturb, to awaken something that for years had slept comfortably beneath the town's propriety. He stubbed out his cigarette, made a brief note in his pocketbook. Letters, civic conscience or personal vendetta, and closed it without satisfaction. Somewhere in the council offices, a typist's desk waited beneath a lamp still warm from morning work. And on that desk, perhaps, rested a sheet of unused paper, pale green, faintly scented, and waiting for the next confession that would sound tomorrow in the quiet post. Flaxborough's Town Amenities Committee met, as it always did, in the former reading room of the Mechanics' Institute, a chamber whose air of studious virtue lingered despite decades of civic indolence. The table was an oblong of worn mahogany, its edges polished by the elbows of successive councillors who mistook friction for progress. On this mild but overcast Tuesday, a sense of moral humidity hung in the air. The meeting's stated purpose was to discuss the repainting of the public lavatories near the railway station, but by the time Inspector Purbright entered, he knew that hygiene was unlikely to feature prominently in the agenda. There was a flavour of apprehension about the room, like the scent of overripe fruit masked by disinfectant. Mrs. Glossop, the mayoress, presided in a state of severe grace. She sat rigidly upright, as though expecting to be sculpted at any moment, a hat resembling a municipal trophy. At her right hand loitered Councillor Hargood, thick-fingered and crimson-cheeked, the air about him carrying faint traces of indignation and eau de cologne. Beside him, Miss Roper, summoned from the typing pool to record minutes, waited with the composure of one who knows the value of invisibility. Purbright, having been invited on the grounds that a police presence might lend tone, took a discreet chair near the radiator and prepared to observe what he privately regarded as one of nature's more comic rituals, a gathering of citizens bent on concealing what everyone already knew. "Before we begin," Mrs. Glossop intoned, "I must address a most unfortunate development." Her voice, though refined, had the carrying quality of moral artillery. She withdrew a folded sheet from her handbag, held it aloft, and surveyed her audience. "This," she declared, "was received by my husband yesterday morning." A rustle moved through the councillors, not unlike the sound of pigeons disturbed on a ledge. "It is anonymous," she continued. "It is malicious, and it concerns certain members of this very committee." Purbright, in his corner, thought of adding that such correspondence rarely concerns anyone else. Councillor Hargood cleared his throat. "Indeed, Madam Mayoress, similar matter has come to my attention. I, too, have been subjected to, impertinent conjecture." Miss Roper's fingers, poised above her notebook, hesitated. No one else noticed. Such hesitations were her specialty. Mrs. Glossop pressed on. "These letters, though differing in particulars, are of identical style. Each purports to express concern for the moral tone of our town. Each contains insinuations, offensive, unfounded, and grammatically irreproachable. Councillor Pember, the town clerk, adjusted his spectacles and offered a sigh of bureaucratic despair. "It would appear, madam, that someone has made mischief with a typewriter and a conscience." Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. As the discussion thickened, the air in the room took on the slow suffocation peculiar to English scandal, polite, fragrant, and inexorable. The councillors spoke in the strained accents of people attempting to locate sin elsewhere. Mr. Bream, the grocer, declared that the tone of public life had been declining ever since mixed choirs were introduced at St. Luke's. Miss Thorne, a retired headmistress, countered that the moral lapse lay in certain masculine tendencies toward familiarity during official engagements. Each remark, Purbright observed, was aimed with the delicacy of archery performed blindfolded. The target was unspoken, yet unmistakable. At last Mrs. Glossop struck the table lightly with a teaspoon. "The fact remains," she said to Hay, "that someone among us, or near to us, has access to confidential knowledge, and this person is prepared to abuse it. We must therefore adopt measures of restraint." "A code of silence, madam," ventured Hargood. "Not silence," she corrected primly. "Dignity." There was a pause while everyone attempted to picture themselves dignified. Miss Roper, seated slightly apart, was not called upon to speak, but her pencil traced each word with dutiful precision. Occasionally her eyes lifted from the page, brief, unmeasured glances that might have been curiosity or quiet pity. Purbright, watching her reflection in the window's dull glass, saw nothing to confirm his growing suspicion, but nothing to dispel it either. When the mayoress finally declared the meeting adjourned, chairs scraped with unusual fervour. Each councillor left in haste to assure someone else of their innocence. Only Purbright lingered, ostensibly to thank Mrs. Glossop for the tea. "I must say," he observed mildly, "there's something almost artistic about anonymous correspondence. It reveals character, even when unsigned." Mrs. Glossop drew herself up. "Disgusting habit, a perversion of literacy." "Indeed, yet one wonders what provokes it." "Envy, Inspector, always envy. People of lesser consequence resent those of standing." Purbright inclined his head. "That, madam, is a motive I rarely find absent." He accepted a biscuit, soggy from excessive civic handling, and excused himself. In the corridor outside he found Miss Roper gathering her papers. She looked up as he approached, and for an instant her expression softened into something like weary amusement. "A difficult meeting?" he remarked. "They usually are, Inspector. Today's only had more embroidery." "You seem to keep your composure admirably." "One must. Panic offends." Purbright considered her words. "And yet, were you to hazard a guess, who do you suppose might write such letters?" She smiled faintly. "Anyone who knows how to spell, I imagine. That narrows it down to a minority." He almost laughed, but politeness restrained him. "You appear to have thought about it." "Only as a typist must think. One cannot help reading what one is asked to type." "Of course." Her hands, he noticed, were steady as she aligned the papers, but a small ink smudge marked her left thumb. A trivial thing, unless one considered that anonymous letters, too, began with ink stains and private thoughts. Later that afternoon, Sergeant Love entered the inspector's office with the hesitant tread of a man carrying gossip disguised as evidence. "Another one, sir," he said, handing over an envelope. "Delivered by hand to the vicarage this morning." Purbright unfolded the letter. The same pale green paper, the same immaculate type, to the Reverend Mallow. It may comfort you to know that the souls in your care are not deceived by your companionship with Mrs. Glossop during so many charitable excursions, Flaxborough observes, and the Lord will judge. Pious, murmured Purbright, almost devotional. Love nodded. They're all from the same machine, sir. Council typewriter, model 1951 Imperial. Could be any of half a dozen in their office. Could be, Purbright agreed, folding the sheet neatly. But only one of those half dozen arrives 10 minutes early each morning. Love blinked. You mean Miss Roper, sir? I mean, said Purbright, that regularity is sometimes more revealing than confession. Though, of course, we mustn't assume. No, sir? Besides, Purbright added, lighting a cigarette, if she's our culprit, she's already achieved something admirable. She's made honesty fashionable again. Love frowned. Fashionable, sir? In the Flaxborough sense, that is to say, disreputable, yet irresistible. That evening, the local paper published a small, cautious notice on page 3. Unsigned letters, puzzle counsel. The borough police are understood to be investigating certain anonymous communications recently received by members of the town council. No official comment has been made. Purbright read the item over supper, noting with mild irritation that his own refusal to comment had been interpreted as confirmation. Across town, others read the same line and drew conclusions of varying warmth. By midnight, Flaxborough's moral imagination had doubled in productivity. The next morning, Purbright visited the offices again under the pretext of returning a misplaced report. Miss Roper was already at her desk, as he expected. The typewriter ticked softly like a well-behaved clock. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, not looking up. "Good morning. Busy as ever, I see." "There's always something to type. Words don't wait." "True," he replied. "But they can hide—" She looked at him then, eyes steady, mouth composed in what might have been politeness or irony. "Not forever," she said. Purbright inclined his head. No, not forever. He left her to her work and descended the narrow staircase. Outside, the town's clock struck 9. The postman wheeled his bicycle past, whistling faintly out of tune. Purbright paused by the doorway, his mind lingering on Miss Roper's remark. Words, he thought, did indeed have a tendency to hide, sometimes in drawers, sometimes behind reputations. The difficulty lay in deciding which deserved to be found. As he turned toward the station, a faint scent of lavender followed him into the cold morning air. He stopped briefly, uncertain whether it came from his coat sleeve or from the envelope he had placed, unopened, in his pocket. There was, in Flaxborough's borough offices, a kind of institutional tranquillity that could be mistaken for cleanliness. Each morning, the corridors filled with the discreet hum of bureaucracy, the click of doors, the rustle of carbon paper, the small symphony of typewriters beginning their day's recital. It was, thought Inspector Purbright as he entered, a curiously devout atmosphere. The place reeked of public virtue, faintly overlaid with polish and lavender. He had requested access to the offices under the respectable pretext of consulting the council's files on civic correspondence, though both he and Sergeant Love understood that his true quarry was subtler. A crime of ink and conscience had taken root here, and in such soil, he knew, the blossoms would be perfumed and poisonous. Miss Edna Roper was the typist most frequently mentioned in connection with the council's letters, mentioned, that is, by implication and lowered voice. Her neatness of manner, her punctuality, and her unbroken record of discretion were qualities that, in Flaxborough, invited suspicion rather than praise. She was already at her desk when Purbright entered the typing room. The clock above her head had only just struck 9. Her fingers moved across the keys with unerring rhythm, as though language itself had consented to be domesticated by her touch. "Good morning, Miss Roper," said Purbright, in a tone designed to imply that he had called upon her only as a courtesy. She looked up, neither surprised nor flustered. "Inspector, I hope you're not here about the heating again." "Not this time," he replied. "I'm afraid I'm here in my more official capacity." She smiled very slightly. "Oh dear, we haven't mislaid the mayor, I trust?" "No," Purbright said, returning the smile. "Though certain letters might suggest we are losing his reputation." Miss Roper's eyes flickered. No more than a blink, but enough to indicate that she understood him perfectly. He stood beside her desk, regarding it as though it were a minor exhibit. Every item, ink bottle, paperweight, and carbon box, had been arranged with the kind of orderliness that repels curiosity. Even the wastepaper basket was empty, which, in Purbright's experience, was as telling as a full confession. "You keep things very neat," he observed. "One must, Inspector. Disorder encourages imagination. A dangerous faculty in an office like this." "I wouldn't know," she said. "I've always thought imagination a privilege of rank." Purbright inclined his head. "A view the council appears to share." He allowed his gaze to wander across the room. 3 other desks, 2 unoccupied, one attended by a younger typist who appeared to have achieved invisibility through effort. Against the far wall stood the filing cabinets, each labelled with precise care. Minutes, memos, civic notices. The air smelled faintly of lavender oil and carbon. It was a feminine scent, clean but oddly mournful. Purbright drew a handkerchief from his pocket under pretext of polishing his spectacles. When he replaced them, he noticed a faint smear of ink upon the top corner of Miss Roper's blotter. "You type all the committee correspondence, I understand," he said. "Yes, Inspector. The official minutes, announcements, and replies to letters, all very dull, I'm afraid. Yet our anonymous friend has made them quite lively. People will find amusement where they can." The remark was spoken lightly, but her eyes did not match the tone. When he had gone, Miss Roper resumed typing with renewed concentration. The click of her machine filled the quiet room. Yet Purbright, who had chosen to linger just outside the doorway, noticed that she paused every few lines, staring not at the page, but toward the small calendar on her desk. It displayed a date 2 days ahead, marked faintly with pencil. He made a mental note, then returned to his station, where Sergeant Love awaited with a face full of cautious expectation. "Well, sir?" Purbright eased himself into a chair. "Our Miss Roper is either entirely innocent or completely prepared. Both conditions are rare." Love scratched his head. Did she seem nervous? No, worse, she seemed reasonable. A reasonable woman in a small town is invariably a problem. In the afternoon, Purbright returned alone under pretense of verifying the council's typewriters. He began at one end of the typing room, methodically testing each machine. Miss Roper, having left for lunch, was absent. From her drawer, neatly divided into compartments, he removed the carbon papers. Most were new. One, however, showed faint indentations. He placed it carefully against the light from the window and discerned partial impressions of words. It is not unkindness that prompts the warning. The rest was illegible. He folded the sheet, placed it in an envelope, and slipped it into his pocket. As he was about to close the drawer, his eye caught a small envelope beneath the carbon box, addressed in delicate script, "To be returned personally." The handwriting was not hers. He opened it just far enough to glimpse the contents, half a sheet of stationery bearing the borough crest, and what appeared to be a poem. He replaced it precisely as found. That evening in his office, Purbright examined the carbon again beneath a magnifying lamp. The letters were unmistakably from the same machine as the anonymous notes, an Imperial 1951 with a distinctive flaw, a faint misalignment in the letter E. "Proof enough for most men," he murmured. But Purbright was not most men. Evidence that arrived too neatly was often an accomplice to deception. He leaned back, considering Miss Roper's face. It was the face of someone who had spent her life being correct, and correctness, he knew, was often a discipline learned in self-defense. There was, too, the matter of the poem. It suggested a correspondence of another kind, one that touched sentiment rather than scandal. If Miss Roper had been exchanging letters of a personal nature, she might have acquired knowledge worth disguising as morality. The thought was interrupted by Sergeant Love's return. "The lab confirms, sir. All the letters so far came from the same ribbon, probably the same typewriter." "Ah, then we've caught the instrument, if not the musician." "What do we do next?" "Wait," said Purbright. "Anonymous letter writers are like hymn singers. They cannot resist a second verse." 2 mornings later, the second verse arrived. This time the recipient was the editor of the Flaxborough Citizen, a man whose notions of propriety were confined to the printed line. The letter advised him to reconsider certain frivolous content unfit for decent readership, and concluded with a remark on the paper's declining spiritual tone. Mr. Hargreaves, the editor, delivered it personally to Purbright, accompanied by the faint scent of ink and outrage. "It's intolerable, Inspector, to suggest that our pages corrupt youth. Youth, mind you, which hasn't been seen reading a newspaper since 1938. "I quite agree," said Purbright. "Nevertheless, your anonymous critic seems unusually well informed. You've had correspondence recently on the Council's expenditure for library improvements?" Hargreaves hesitated. "Confidential, of course, but yes." Typed replies. "From the borough offices, naturally." Purbright nodded. "Naturally." He called at the typing room again that afternoon. Miss Roper looked up, expression unruffled, though her eyes betrayed fatigue. "I hope I'm not interrupting," said Purbright. "Not at all. We rarely have excitement here. You're quite the novelty." He smiled faintly. "Novelty can be alarming." "Only if it expects to be welcomed." Purbright regarded her hands, fine, disciplined hands, the nails short and pale. On her left wrist he noticed a faint mark, as though from a watch recently removed. "I wonder, Miss Roper," he said, "if you've ever encountered the phrase morning mist?" "The stationery?" "Yes." She paused only a moment. "A popular brand. Mr. Beasley sells a box for every lady in the parish who enjoys correspondence." "Do you?" "I write only when necessary." "Necessary can be a flexible word." "So can innocent," she replied. He laughed quietly. "Touché." When he left, she returned to her typewriter. The sound followed him down the corridor, steady, unbroken, as though she were typing not for the present, but for posterity. That evening, as Purbright reviewed his notes, he found his certainty dissolving into a kind of reluctant admiration. If Miss Roper was indeed the author of the letters, she had achieved a balance rare in crime, malice executed with perfect manners. He placed the carbon paper beside the growing file and turned out the light. For a moment, he considered the envelope he had left unopened in her drawer, the poem signed, "To be returned personally." A poem required a reader. Perhaps, he thought, Miss Roper had once written, not to accuse, but to be understood. Perhaps these letters were simply a continuation of that impulse, written in the only language Flaxborough allowed, polite reproach. Still, speculation was indulgence. He closed the file. The smell of lavender lingered faintly on his cuff. Somewhere in the quiet town, another letter was likely being typed, calmly, precisely, its sentences sharpened to the dignity of scandal. And somewhere between the lines, he suspected, the typist was saying something truer than confession. The meeting of the Parish Welfare Committee was not, by most definitions, an event designed to generate intrigue. Its proceedings generally concerned raffle books, chrysanthemums, and the appropriate distribution of sandwiches. Yet as Inspector Purbright observed that Thursday afternoon from the back row of the parish hall, the atmosphere possessed the peculiar tautness that arises only when everyone present is pretending to enjoy themselves. The rector, Reverend Simcox, presided with his usual blend of moral gravity and domestic bewilderment. He was a tall man whose clerical dignity had long since been domesticated by his parishioners. His spectacles glimmered like tiny theological lanterns above a face more suited to disappointment than doctrine. Purbright, though not a member of the committee, had been invited as an observer, a term which in Flaxborough meant a cause of discomfort to at least 3 people. On this occasion, those 3 were distinctly defined: Miss Edna Roper, typist, and minute-keeper, Mrs. Goff, the mayor's wife, and Councillor Briggs, whose passion for procedure was equalled only by his distaste for being investigated. Mrs. Goff was speaking in her well-trained tones about the anonymous letters which had lately arrived at several prominent addresses, including, it was whispered, the rectory itself. She pronounced the subject distasteful but necessary, which was precisely how she described housework. "I do think," she said, with the careful enunciation of one performing rectitude for an audience, "that we must take a stand against such malicious correspondence. It undermines the moral tone of the town. If we do nothing, we are complicit." The rector nodded gravely. "Indeed, indeed. Yet I would urge charity. These letters, unpleasant though they are, may well come from a person more to be pitied than condemned." Councillor Briggs, whose pity seldom survived contact with the ratepayer, sniffed. "I pity the police, Rector. They're expected to trace cowardice through carbon paper." Purbright smiled slightly but said nothing. Silence, he knew, was the most productive form of participation in village committees. Miss Roper, sitting at the end of the table with her notebook, continued to take minutes with the same poise she might have brought to a recital. Her handwriting, neat and uniform, offered no hint of the thoughts that accompanied it. Purbright, seated where he could see her hand move, wondered whether it might be capable of 2 distinct languages, one public, one private. The meeting meandered through its agenda, the forthcoming jumble sale and the question of the new churchyard gate, the rector's brief homily on temperance in gossip. It was during this last that Mrs. Goff's composure began to falter. "I think," she said, her voice tightening, "that the harm lies not only in gossip, but in the presumption of moral authority by those least qualified to hold it. Anonymous letters are the work of a person of small courage and smaller grace." There was a pause, discreetly filled by the rector's cough. Miss Roper's pen hesitated only briefly before continuing its steady line across the page. "Would you record that sentiment, Miss Roper?" asked Mrs. Goff. "Certainly," came the calm reply. "Shall I include small grace or merely imply it?" A faint, scandalized titter rippled through the room. Purbright, suppressing a smile, made a mental note. Beneath her uniform politeness, Miss Roper possessed a blade. After the meeting adjourned, there followed the ritual tea, a ceremony designed to reward endurance with tepid beverage and stale virtue. The committee members clustered around a trestle table, its offerings dominated by scones of geological density. Mrs. Goff, perhaps regretting her earlier sharpness, approached Miss Roper with the uncertain graciousness of a hostess attempting to rescue decorum. "My dear, you were quite right to correct me. I'm afraid I speak too freely when provoked." "Not at all," said Miss Roper. "Freedom of speech is encouraged, provided it's never mistaken for honesty." Purbright, who was stirring his tea beside the rector, caught the remark and allowed himself a quiet inward amusement. "Your Miss Roper," murmured the rector, "is a woman of formidable self-command. I sometimes think she'd make a fine curate, were she less attached to accuracy." "Indeed," said Purbright, "and accuracy is so rarely a social grace." It was during the clearing of cups that the small but significant incident occurred. Mrs. Goff, in gathering her handbag, dislodged a folded sheet of paper that slipped unseen to the floor. Purbright, stooping to assist, picked it up and handed it back with a mild bow. Thank you, Inspector," she said, with a flutter of embarrassment. "I seem to be shedding correspondence like a politician." He caught a glimpse of the heading. Morning Mist. Personal. When she had gone, he allowed the phrase to turn over quietly in his mind. Later that afternoon, Purbright called at the rectory for what the rector called a medicinal sherry. It was the kind of house where furniture appeared to have taken holy orders, each chair resigned to its vocation. The rector's wife, a small woman whose voice rarely achieved declaration, brought in a plate of currant biscuits. "I hear," she said to Purbright, "that you've been consorting with the committee. A dreadful ordeal. Did Mrs. Goff behave?" "As well as can be expected under moral strain," said Purbright. The rector chuckled. "You see, Mildred, even the police find virtue exhausting." They sipped in companionable silence for a few moments. Then the rector grew thoughtful. "It's curious," he said slowly, "but one of those letters was left under the church door this morning. Not posted, left. As though the writer wanted proximity to sanctity, but not discovery." Purbright's eyebrows rose. "You've read it?" "Of course. It warns against the creeping impropriety of our civic class, which, I'm afraid, includes myself, though it congratulates me for not yet succumbing to the fleshy temptations of bureaucratic fellowship." Mrs. Simcox looked faintly alarmed. "Good heavens, Arthur, that sounds positively salacious." "I fear it was meant to." He handed the folded page to Purbright. "Typed, naturally." Purbright examined it under the lamplight. Same misaligned E, same faint scent of lavender. He refolded it carefully. "I believe, Rector, that your correspondent prefers moral theatre to moral instruction." "Yes," said Simcox dryly, "and prefers the vicarage letterbox to confession." Outside, dusk had deepened into a delicate fog, the kind that settled over Flaxborough like discretion itself. Purbright walked back toward the station, his thoughts gathering shape. The appearance of the Morning Mist stationery at Mrs. Goff's side and the letter at the church door suggested either a deliberate connection or a convenient coincidence, which in Flaxborough often meant the same thing. He arrived to find Sergeant Love waiting by the gas heater, a newspaper spread over his knees. "Ah, sir," said Love, "another letter came in this afternoon, addressed to the editor again, but hand-delivered this time. Claims to defend the sanctity of womanhood from public compromise." "Ah," said Purbright, "a gallant pen." "Same typing?" "The very same, sir. That odd little tilt on the E." Purbright sat down and reached for his pipe, though he did not light it. Then our author's purpose grows ambitious. Moral renovation of the entire town, beginning with its newspaper and its clergy. Admirable in intention, if not execution. Love frowned. "Do you think it's Miss Roper, then?" Purbright hesitated. "She remains compelling, but there's a problem with obvious suspects, Love. They tend to notice themselves being suspected, and when that happens, the real mischief begins." At that same hour, in her small rented room above the chemist's, Miss Roper sat by the narrow window, her typewriter gleaming faintly in the lamplight. The room was modest, but tidy. Everything had its place, including a half-empty box of Morning Mist stationery on the side table. She was not typing now. Instead, she was reading, a small volume of poetry, its pages faintly foxed. On the inside cover was an inscription written in a careful masculine hand, to ER, in gratitude for her discretion. She closed the book and laid it on the desk beside a single envelope, unaddressed. Her eyes lingered on it with an expression that hovered between amusement and resolve. Then, with a motion almost ritual in its grace, she slipped the envelope into the drawer and turned the key. Back at the police station, Purbright leaned over the rector's letter once more. He read the final line, which seemed to shimmer with self-righteous delight. There are those who cloak sin in respectability, and those who reveal it in kindness. He smiled faintly. Flaxborough, he murmured, does rather specialize in both. He placed the letter on his desk and looked toward the window. Outside, the fog thickened, softening the lamps to halos. Somewhere within that polite obscurity, he imagined a typist bending over her keys, each word a note of conscience, or perhaps revenge. He would need to visit the chemist's building tomorrow under pretext of civic routine. For now, though, he allowed the evening to absorb his thoughts as though the town itself were listening. And as the clock marked the hour, a single question drifted quietly through his mind, so quiet it almost refused to be spoken. Was Miss Roper writing about the high town, or to it? Flaxborough's High Street, though respectable in daylight, had an air of mild decay by late afternoon. Its shop windows glowed faintly through a thin film of dust and civic pride. The chemist's establishment, C. Dobson & Son, occupied a corner spot near the post office, its frontage distinguished by gilt lettering that had long since begun to tarnish. Within, the faint scent of liniment and lavender mingled with the sterility of things too well ordered. Inspector Purbright entered with the quiet purpose of a man who intended to buy nothing but observation. A small bell announced his presence with the modest arrogance of propriety. Behind the counter, Mr. Clive Dobson, a man whose moustache seemed permanently affronted by the world, greeted him with cautious civility. "Inspector, good afternoon. We're not in any trouble, I hope?" "Not yet, Mr. Dobson. I come bearing neither warrant nor ailment." "That's a mercy. I can offer a tonic, of course, should you wish to forestall either." "Tempting," said Purbright. "But I'm more interested in your lodgers than your tonics." The chemist's brows climbed a fraction. "Miss Roper, you mean?" "Indeed." Mr. Dobson leaned one elbow on the counter, adopting the pose of a man reluctantly acquainted with gossip. "A quiet lady, Inspector, punctual rent, tidy habits, keeps to herself. She does type, though, rather late at night. The noise carries down through the ceiling, like an anxious cricket. My wife says it's harmless, but you know how sound travels through old plaster." "Quite," said Purbright. "You've no cause for complaint?" "None at all, though she does have callers." "Callers?" "Yes, evenings mostly. Well, one caller, really, always the same, Mr. Briggs from the council. He comes about once a fortnight, brings papers sometimes, and stays perhaps 20 minutes. Purbright's expression did not alter. Official matters, no doubt. "Undoubtedly," said Mr. Dobson with the blandness of a man who has practiced disbelief. "My wife says they discuss minutes, which seems rather a long word for such short visits." The inspector's eyes rested briefly on a glass case of cough mixtures. "And you've observed nothing unusual? No letters, for instance, being posted?" "Oh, letters, yes. She's regular about them." "Early morning, before breakfast." "She walks to the pillar box at 7:30 precisely. A model of efficiency, I should say." "Quite so," murmured Purbright. "Efficiency is rarely a spontaneous virtue." Mr. Dobson looked faintly puzzled. "You're not suggesting anything improper, Inspector?" Purbright smiled. "Impropriety, Mr. Dobson, is seldom suggested. It declares itself, usually in ink. He left the shop a few minutes later, carrying with him the faint odour of camphor and a new fragment of the town's moral tapestry. Outside the air was chill. The evening edition of the Flaxborough Citizen was being stacked in the window of the newsagent's opposite. The headline read, "Council Morality Under Fire, Anonymous Letters Continue." Purbright crossed the street and watched the reflection of the chemist's window in the glass of the newsagent's door. In the reflection the shop appeared reversed and oddly transparent, as if the secrets of the upper rooms were only waiting for the right light to reveal themselves. Later that evening, Purbright sat in his office, turning over the day's findings. Sergeant Love entered with a mug of tea and his habitual frown of puzzlement. "I've been going through the file again, sir," said Love. "All the letters, same typewriter, same paper, same perfume. But if it's Miss Roper, why go to the trouble of delivering some by hand? Seems risky." Purbright nodded. "Risk often serves vanity. Our writer wants not only to be believed, but to be admired." "Admired, sir?" "Oh, yes. Moralists, Sergeant, are the vainest people alive. They cannot endure to be thought unnecessary." Love considered this. "Then she's writing them for attention?" "Not attention," said Purbright. "Acknowledgement. There's a difference. One is vulgar, the other quite refined." Love sighed. "I'd hate to be refined, sir. Seems exhausting." "Quite so," said Purbright mildly. He glanced at the latest letter, the one left at the church door. Its content was as pompous as it was precise. Yet in the margins there appeared a faint smudge, perhaps from a fingertip. Purbright reached for his magnifying lens. The mark had the texture of powder, not soot, not ink, something finer. "Talcum," he murmured, "possibly lavender." Love looked up. "From the chemist's?" Purbright smiled. "Where else?" The following morning he paid another visit to Mr. Dobson's shop, this time at opening hour. The chemist's wife, a pink-faced woman, with the disposition of a cautious sparrow, was dusting the display shelves. "Good morning, Mrs. Dobson," said Purbright. "Forgive me for intruding at so early an hour." "Oh, not at all, Inspector. My husband's gone to the post. I expect he'll be back shortly." "I merely wished to inquire. Miss Roper, she left for work?" "Just a few minutes ago, always so prompt. Never misses her post, that one. I see her every morning with her little bundle of envelopes. Neat as you please, always tied with blue ribbon." "Blue ribbon?" "Yes, isn't that peculiar? I asked her once why, and she said, because paper likes to feel respected." Such a way of speaking, Inspector, like she's quoting someone who's listening. Purbright smiled faintly. "Indeed. A philosophical typist is an uncommon luxury in Flaxborough." Mrs. Dobson giggled, a sound that fluttered rather than echoed. "You've quite the turn of phrase, Inspector. Would you care for some cough drops on the house?" "Very kind," said Purbright, "but I'll confine myself to curiosity for now." He lingered outside as Miss Roper appeared at the far end of the street, walking briskly in her neat brown coat and gloves. Her posture conveyed modest precision, yet something about her gait suggested a mind measuring each step. At the pillar box she paused, glanced around almost imperceptibly, and dropped 3 envelopes inside. Then she stood for a moment as though waiting for the act to settle into anonymity. When she turned, her eyes met Purbright's across the street. She did not startle, nor did she smile. Her expression was one of polite fatigue, like someone accustomed to being slightly misunderstood. With a small nod, she continued toward the borough offices. Purbright remained where he was, watching the pillar box. Its red paint gleamed faintly in the morning sun, a receptacle of civic duty and perhaps mischief. Later, at the station, the postmaster delivered the day's collection for examination. Among the envelopes were the 3 he had observed, each addressed in careful typing, each bearing a faint trace of lavender scent. The postmarks would obscure origin, but the precision of the spacing was unmistakable. Love examined one under the magnifier. "Same ribbon flaw," he said, "that crookedy again." "Indeed," said Purbright, "though I wonder if our writer has yet realized that consistency, while admirable in morals, is fatal in forgery." He slipped one envelope into his pocket. "Let this one travel unhindered. The others can rest here for now." "Who's the recipient?" asked Love. Purbright turned the envelope slightly. "Ah, Mrs. Goff, how very democratic of our typist to distribute scandal in all directions." That evening, Purbright returned briefly to the chemist's corner. The lamplight glowed softly on the upper window of Miss Roper's room. A faint shadow moved behind the curtain, slow, deliberate, as if weighing the substance of a thought. The rhythmic tap of a typewriter drifted down through the dusk. He stood there for some minutes, listening. The sound, oddly soothing, reminded him of rainfall, steady, anonymous, and purifying in its persistence. Mr. Dobson emerged presently to take down the shop's open sign. "Working late again, Inspector," he said, with mild curiosity. "Just admiring the efficiency of your tenant." "Ah, yes, she's a rare one, Miss Roper. I sometimes think she types for comfort, like praying, only more audible." "Or confiding," said Purbright, "a kind of mechanical conscience." Mr. Dobson looked doubtful. "Well, as long as it's paid for quarterly, I don't mind its moral purpose." Purbright smiled. "A sound philosophy, Mr. Dobson." When the chemist had gone inside, Purbright lingered another moment by the lamplit pavement. From the upper window came one final sound, a pause, then the sharp metallic clack of carriage return. He imagined the letter, newly finished, folded with immaculate precision. Perhaps it would be tied with that blue ribbon, placed among others in a drawer like trophies of righteousness. But for whom were they written? Not the recipients, surely. They were merely instruments. No, it was the town itself that was being addressed, its petty pretensions recorded, carbon copied, and corrected. Purbright glanced once more at the window. The curtain shifted ever so slightly, as though acknowledging his scrutiny. Then it was still. He walked back toward the station, the rhythm of his steps echoing faintly on the cobblestones. The evening held its breath, the air faintly scented with lavender. At the corner he paused, struck by a thought so quiet it seemed to belong to someone else. Was the typist confessing or accusing? The difference, he reflected, was often just a matter of tone. The mayor's drawing-room, despite the borough's civic pretensions, had a warm air of complacency that afternoon. Its heavy curtains were drawn against the sunlight, leaving the small space lit only by a cluster of gas lamps and the reflective sheen of polished mahogany. A faint aroma of boiled sweets mingled with the residue of recent tea, a combination both comforting and vaguely antiseptic. Inspector Purbright entered with his habitual discretion. He had been invited, ostensibly, to witness a reception honouring Mrs. Goff's charitable contributions, a social event whose agenda, he suspected, consisted largely of careful conversation and quiet observation of neighbours' manners. Mrs. Goff herself presided over the gathering with a resolute elegance. Her gown, a pale shade of civility, reflected both light and status. She greeted Purbright with a polite nod, as though assessing whether the inspector's presence would lend gravity to the afternoon or merely emphasize the subtle dangers of gossip. The assembly was a study in civility. Councillor Briggs, flushed and restless, hovered near the refreshments, attempting casual conversation that frequently lapsed into the recital of civic grievances. Reverend Simcox was present, casting the occasional moral glance toward a neighbour, a gesture of subtle correction designed to keep social improprieties in check without overt reprimand. Purbright took his station near the mantelpiece, ostensibly to admire the mayor's modest collection of civic memorabilia. From this vantage, he could observe the careful choreography of the assembly, the polite inclination of heads, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact, the tiny, almost imperceptible sighs when conversation strayed into uncomfortable territory. Mrs. Goff began addressing her guests with a tone that balanced generosity and admonition. "I am delighted to see so many friends gathered here," she said. "It is a reminder that while our town is small, our sense of duty, and indeed our capacity for scrutiny, remains large." Purbright noted the slight tightening around her eyes. The remark, though superficially welcoming, carried a covert signal. Vigilance, even in civility, was demanded. He allowed his attention to drift to Miss Roper, who had been invited to assist with the recording of names and donations. She occupied a corner of the room with unobtrusive composure, her notebook open but her eyes observing, noting, registering. It was evident that the typist's attention was not on the afternoon's tea, nor the carefully managed pleasantries, but rather on the subtleties of human behaviour. Councillor Briggs approached Miss Roper under the guise of delivering a small contribution to the collection box. His fingers trembled slightly as he handed her the coin, and Purbright caught the briefest flicker of curiosity in Miss Roper's gaze. She accepted the offering with a nod, penciled a notation, and returned her attention to the room, as though nothing had occurred. Purbright made a mental note. Simple gestures, he knew, often revealed far more than grand declarations. The conversation among the assembled dignitaries inevitably returned to the anonymous letters. Mrs. Goff's tone, carefully measured, implied moral indignation without accusation. "It is quite unacceptable," she said, "for individuals to presume to instruct their betters in civility, without signature or acknowledgment. We must trust our own judgment, and that of our neighbours, rather than succumb to fear." Reverend Simcox murmured agreement. "Indeed, but fear often disguises itself as moral vigilance, does it not?" "A fair observation," said Purbright, speaking softly, as though reminding the rector and the mayor simultaneously. "And vigilance without evidence is, unfortunately, a currency the small town trades in liberally." A faint tension rippled through the room. Mrs. Goff's lips pursed in a manner suggesting mild disapproval, an invitation to reflection rather than confrontation. Tea was served in china cups, whose delicate floral patterns seemed almost apologetic for their utility. Mrs. Goff moved among her guests, refilling cups with precise attention, ensuring that conversation never faltered. She paused near Purbright. "You observe much, Inspector," she said. "I trust Flaxborough remains in your eyes sufficiently moral to withstand its minor intrigues." Purbright sipped his tea. "The town's morality," he said, "is of a persistent quality, sometimes admirable, sometimes inconvenient. It thrives on scrutiny and flourishes under rumour." Mrs. Goff raised an eyebrow but said nothing further. She moved on, leaving Purbright to watch the interaction of his neighbours, each careful in gesture, each concealing small calculations behind polite smiles. A minor disruption occurred when a note was discreetly handed to Mrs. Goff by her butler. She unfolded it with careful composure, though her hands betrayed a subtle hesitation. The envelope bore the same neat type as the letters Purbright had seen before. She read it quickly, folded it, and placed it in her handbag. No expression betrayed the content, but Purbright observed her shoulders stiffen ever so slightly, a signal almost imperceptible, yet enough to suggest unease. He did not interrupt. Observation, he knew, was more revealing when silent. Later, when the reception had drawn to its polite conclusion, Purbright found an opportunity to speak briefly with Mrs. Goff in the hall. "Another letter, I presume?" he said, with gentle formality. She inclined her head. "Yes, Inspector. Delivered this morning. Its warnings, while courteous, are no less pointed." "Does it trouble you?" "A touch," she admitted, "though I cannot decide whether it is scandal or instruction." Purbright smiled faintly. "Often in Flaxborough the difference is merely in perception." She nodded, as though conceding this nuanced truth. As he left the mayor's residence, Purbright paused on the doorstep. The afternoon sunlight had faded, leaving the street lamplit and silent. From an upper window a faint shadow moved, a delicate, deliberate motion that suggested a hand at work. He knew, with the calm certainty that accompanies long experience, that Miss Roper had observed the reception closely. She had noted gestures, expressions, and subtle pauses with the precision of one trained to record what most people miss. The question that remained, quiet but insistent, was whether her notes were merely for memory or for influence. Purbright adjusted his overcoat and walked toward the station. The town, in its subdued bustle, seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere, in a small room above the chemist's, a typewriter awaited, ready to translate observation into judgment. And in that anticipation lay the faintest clue. A page left open on the desk, its ink still warm, suggesting that not all of Flaxborough's secrets would remain polite for long. Flaxborough's public library, a modest brick building crowned by a slate roof and a small bell turret, had acquired over the years a reputation for discretion almost as strong as the town's moral sensibilities. It was, Inspector Purbright reflected, an ideal location to observe human behavior without drawing attention. The hall was lined with tall, well-worn shelves, each crammed with books whose spines carried not only knowledge, but the faint patina of years of polite handling. Purbright had arrived shortly after opening, ostensibly to consult the municipal archives regarding past committee correspondence. In reality, he intended to observe Miss Roper's movements and habits, subtle signs that might betray the typist's secret enterprise. The library attendant, a young woman named Miss Pettigrew, greeted him with a professional nod. "Inspector Purbright, you're early today." "I find morning hours conducive to reflection," he replied, "and unobtrusive observation." Miss Pettigrew's expression, a combination of curiosity and mild suspicion, suggested she had learned to accept his presence without attempting to understand it. Miss Roper entered shortly afterward, carrying her usual leather satchel and a small parcel of letters tied with a blue ribbon. She moved directly to the reference section, placing the bag carefully beside a chair, and began consulting the municipal files. Her posture, precise and unhurried, suggested a mind that measured each movement as carefully as her typing. Purbright took a discreet seat a few rows away, pretending to examine a volume on civic statutes. From this vantage, he could note the subtleties of her behavior, the slight tilt of her head when reading, the intermittent pauses as though weighing not merely the content, but the implications of each document. It was evident that she was consulting material that extended beyond simple office routine. Several of the letters she carried were laid open beside the files, and she occasionally glanced toward the library entrance, though no one had yet approached her. After some minutes, Councillor Briggs appeared, entering with a deliberate casualness that betrayed anxiety. He moved toward Miss Roper, offering a mild smile as though to suggest the visit was purely professional. "Good morning, Miss Roper," he said. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Councillor," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. "I was simply reviewing the archives." He peered at the files. "Ah, yes, very thorough, as always." Purbright noted the slight stiffness in the councillor's shoulders, a combination of propriety and apprehension. Briggs lingered for a few moments, ostensibly to consult a volume, but his gaze repeatedly flicked toward Miss Roper's letters. Eventually, he left with a curt nod, the faintest crease forming between his brows. Miss Roper returned immediately to her meticulous note-taking, as though nothing had occurred. The library's atmosphere was punctuated only by the soft rustle of pages and the distant ticking of a wall clock. Purbright allowed himself to observe the minutiae. The gentle curl of paper corners, the faint indentation of carbon sheets, the alignment of books in neat rows, each detail a marker of the order Miss Roper valued so highly. At one point, a patron approached the reference desk seeking guidance on local history. Miss Roper rose, offered assistance with unobtrusive competence, and returned to her desk, her expression betraying no emotion beyond polite attentiveness. It was a performance, Purbright realized, executed with precision to deflect both curiosity and suspicion. By mid-morning, Miss Roper had produced a small bundle of notes copied from the archives into her own handwriting. Purbright observed that she did not rush, though the efficiency of her movements suggested that this task was routine. She paused occasionally, holding a pencil above a line, then correcting a word with meticulous care. There was a rhythm to her work, measured, deliberate, and almost meditative. Yet within that rhythm lay subtle signs, a brief hesitation when encountering a particular name, a slight tightening of the lips when reading certain entries. The typist's attention was not merely on the documents themselves, but on the people behind them. Purbright, who had grown accustomed to discerning intention through observation, began to suspect that she was drawing connections invisible to the casual observer. Shortly before noon, Miss Roper rose and gathered her materials. She arranged the letters, files, and notes with the same care she applied to her typing desk. The blue ribbon was retied around the letters, each fold precise. She glanced toward the entrance once more, then, with the poise of someone accustomed to being observed, left the library quietly. Purbright waited a few minutes before following, descending the steps with an eye on her direction. She did not proceed directly to the borough offices, but instead turned toward the post office, moving with deliberate but measured speed. At the pillar box, she deposited the letters she had carried, pausing briefly to glance about the street. The motion was slight, almost imperceptible, yet Purbright noted it, a moment of calculation, the faintest acknowledgement of potential observation. She then departed, leaving the postbox to its civic duties and, by extension, to the anonymous judgments that would follow. Back at the station, Purbright and Sergeant Love reviewed the day's developments. "She's meticulous, sir," said Love, almost painfully so. "But these pauses you noticed, what do they signify?" "Caution," said Purbright, "and perhaps a subtle thrill. Writing such letters in a small town requires both daring and discretion." "Discretion seems to be her specialty," Love observed. "Indeed," Purbright agreed. "But one should never mistake discretion for innocence. Sometimes the two coexist precisely because the writer wishes to be overlooked." Love examined the letters again under magnification. The faint lavender trace persisted, and the irregular alignment of the letter A remained evident. "It's consistent, sir. No question of that." Purbright nodded. "Yet what is consistent in form may conceal ingenuity in content. We must consider motive as well as method." That evening, Purbright visited the post office. The clerk, a young man with nervous hands, produced the morning's collection. Several letters bore the same type and paper. The inspector handled them with careful attention, noting subtle differences in crease and envelope sealing. "These minor variations," he said to Love, "indicate the letters are prepared individually, not batch-typed. The writer wishes them to appear spontaneous while maintaining unmistakable style, a delicate performance of control. Love whistled softly. "A craftsperson of letters, sir." "Or a tactician," said Purbright. "Every act of civility in Flaxborough carries consequence. Even letters, unsigned and anonymous, influence perception in ways more subtle than a spoken rebuke." As he walked back toward his office, Purbright considered Miss Roper's discipline. The precision of her movements, the control of her work, and the careful deployment of observation suggested a mind attuned to both pattern and discretion. And yet, he reflected, the greatest danger often resides where diligence masks intention. At the corner of the street, the lamplight caught a single piece of paper fluttering near the curb, a scrap perhaps discarded by the typist, or perhaps intended to be discovered. Purbright retrieved it and examined it carefully. It bore a faint pencil notation in the corner, "For reflection only." He allowed the thought to linger. Not all letters were intended for delivery, he realized. Some were written solely to rehearse judgment, to measure the town's response before committing ink to paper. And in that small revelation lay a subtle shift in understanding. The typist's letters were as much about observing the observers as correcting the observed. Purbright pocketed the slip, his mind already tracing the delicate connections between the letters, the recipients, and the pauses he had noted in her behavior. Somewhere, in the quiet of the chemist's room above, Miss Roper was composing not merely correspondence, but an argument, polished and precise, with Flaxborough itself as the audience. For the first time, he wondered whether she was confessor, accuser, or strategist, and whether the town would ever recognize the difference. The council chambers were, as always, an exercise in deliberate propriety. High-backed chairs lined the walls, polished to a reflective gloss that exaggerated every movement of those seated. The chamber smelled faintly of varnish and damp wool, the twin fragrances of civic diligence and habitual cold draughts. Inspector Purbright entered quietly, nodding to the clerk at the entrance, whose expression suggested that even routine inspection was a potential threat to decorum. Purbright's presence was, he suspected, expected, but not welcomed. Councillor Briggs and several committee members were already assembled, discussing the agenda with the careful cadence of those well-practiced in avoiding offence while asserting authority. At the table, papers were arranged with ceremonial exactitude, minutes laid precisely in order, ink still glinting from previous deliberations. The discussion began with mundane civic matters, the allocation of flower beds, the repair of curbstones, and the ordering of stationery for various committees. Yet, as is the habit of small towns under scrutiny, the conversation soon circled back to the anonymous letters described by Councillor Briggs as a most inconveniently persistent commentary on our personal and professional conduct. Purbright, seated near the head of the table, allowed the words to drift over him without immediate response. His attention was divided between the document files in front of him and the expressions of those around the table. Mrs. Goff, present for oversight, smiled thinly, her fingers interlaced so tightly that they resembled a demonstration in restraint. "The letters," she said, "may be harmless in intention, but they expose a deficiency of tact. Even those of us accustomed to polite rebuke may find them intrusive and potentially misleading," added Councillor Henderson, whose voice was a blend of worry and the faintest hint of moral indignation. "One cannot overstate the dangers of misinterpretation, especially when the writer's identity is unknown." Purbright inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a truth most of the chamber would have preferred left unspoken. He turned his attention to the minutes from the previous meeting, which Miss Roper had prepared with exemplary precision. Each word reflected diligence, but Purbright noticed the subtle marks she had left, a faint, underline here, a small dot beside certain motions there. They suggested observation rather than emphasis, an almost imperceptible annotation that implied a thought beneath the recorded fact. The question arose in his mind, was she merely an impartial recorder, or an active participant observing the moral theatre of Flaxborough? The distinction, he realized, was both crucial and elusive. Councillor Briggs, ever vigilant against perceived impropriety, suddenly leaned forward. "If I may," he said, "it seems to me that someone in our midst has been judging not only the letter of the law, but the letter of conduct. And though I am not a man given to suspicion, one cannot ignore the implications of such discreet commentary." Purbright's eyes followed the gesture of Briggs's hand. It rested briefly on the corner of the desk where the council papers were stacked, and though no specific accusation was uttered, the implication was evident. The anonymous letters had transformed into a social barometer, and someone within reach might be orchestrating their distribution. Mrs. Goff shifted slightly, smoothing the folds of her dress. "Judgment," she said mildly, "is best delivered privately and with restraint. Public moralizing rarely advances the cause of virtue." Purbright noted the delicacy of her phrasing. It was as though she were addressing both the committee and the invisible correspondent at once. The chamber clerk, a man whose discretion was his only notable characteristic, passed a small bundle of correspondence to the mayor, who opened it with careful deliberation. Purbright recognized the handwriting immediately, precise, measured, and familiar from the letters delivered to other dignitaries. "Another," whispered Councillor Henderson, his voice pitched for private consumption, yet audible enough to suggest alarm. "It has been delivered directly to my office as well." Purbright studied the bundle briefly. The letters shared the same paper, the same type, and the subtle, deliberate misalignment in the letter E that he had traced before. The faint scent of lavender, almost imperceptible, persisted, as though the writer insisted on leaving a personal signature despite anonymity. He folded his hands and regarded the chamber with mild amusement. The tension was understated yet complete. The anxiety of reputation mingled with the careful performance of propriety, creating a stage upon which every gesture carried moral significance. During the afternoon session, Purbright requested a private word with the clerk. "Tell me, sir," he said, "are there patterns to the delivery of these letters? Times, recipients, or unusual circumstances?" The clerk, a man more accustomed to filing than speculation, considered carefully. "They arrive early, usually before the office opens. No envelope bears a postmark, sir, and the sealing is invariably neat. It is almost as if the letters wish to remain unobserved until acknowledged." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed? And do you notice if any individual appears aware of these deliveries beforehand?" The clerk shook his head. "No, sir. That is what puzzles everyone. The letters are received discreetly, yet seem tailored to provoke reflection among the recipients." "That," said Purbright softly, "is exactly the intention of someone highly competent in observation." Later, the council took a brief recess. Purbright wandered among the chairs and tables, noting details invisible during formal proceedings. A faint indentation on a desk, suggesting a letter had recently rested there, a curl of paper lifted by a draft, a pencil mark nearly imperceptible at the edge of the mayor's notes. Each was a fragment, a potential signal of action unseen. He paused beside the mayor's chair, observing the subtle arrangements, the papers stacked to suggest order, the ink bottle placed just so, the chair slightly angled from the table. These gestures, small and deliberate, reflected the cumulative consciousness of a town accustomed to measured observation. And at the centre of it all, he imagined, was the typist, quiet, precise, and disciplined, her letters serving as both mirror and measure. When the committee reconvened, the letters became the subject of cautious discussion. Councillor Briggs spoke again, his tone more tempered. Perhaps we should consider that the writer's intent is not solely criticism, but instruction, not malice, but reflection. Reflection, repeated Mrs. Goff, is a polite word for examination. An examination, while necessary, can be profoundly uncomfortable. Purbright allowed a pause to hang in the air before speaking himself. Indeed, and it is precisely in that discomfort that truth often resides. The letters, though anonymous, perform a civic function, to reveal what is otherwise assumed, to render visible the subtleties of moral conduct. Several heads nodded, though with varying degrees of conviction. The chamber, once bustling with procedural energy, now absorbed the notion with quiet tension, the type that marks a town measuring itself against an unseen standard. As the meeting drew to a close, Purbright requested the mayor's attention for a brief word. The mayor, accustomed to the inspector's subtle interventions, granted a private audience in his office. "Inspector," he began, "these letters, if indeed they come from someone within the town, do they indicate malice or merely observation?" Purbright considered the question, tapping a finger lightly against the polished wood. "Observation often masquerades as malice, your worship, especially when conducted with precision and discretion, but the fact that they provoke anxiety is itself a testament to their efficacy." The mayor regarded him in silence. "And Miss Roper?" Purbright allowed a faint, dry smile. "She remains a person of remarkable composure. Observant, precise, disciplined. Whether that translates into authorship or simply understanding is not yet certain. But one cannot ignore the possibility that she is both observer and correspondent." As he left the chambers, Purbright lingered in the corridor, noting the faint marks on the floor where chairs had been moved, the slight tilt of the window allowing a glimpse of the street below. Somewhere along the path, he imagined, letters awaited dispatch, observations awaited transcription, and the town itself continued to perform under the unacknowledged scrutiny of a watchful typist. He paused by the doorway, glancing back at the empty council table. On it lay a single envelope, innocuous in appearance, yet unmistakably tied with a ribbon of pale blue. It had not been delivered, not yet, but it spoke silently of intent. And in that quiet, he realized, the next measure of Flaxborough's civility, or its hypocrisy, would soon be revealed. The typist's hand was not idle, and the town would feel her touch, even if they did not yet perceive it. The rectory, a modest Victorian house with ivy climbing its south-facing wall, carried the quiet dignity of restrained authority. Inspector Purbright arrived in the early afternoon, guided by the peculiar impulse that certain truths reveal themselves only in private parlour rooms, amid tea, biscuits, and measured observation. The air was tinged faintly with lemon polish and the scent of paper, the last likely a remnant of Reverend Simcox's habit of writing notes to his parishioners on good stationery. Reverend Simcox greeted Purbright with his customary blend of clerical civility and private disquiet. "Ah, Inspector, do come in. I trust your morning was untroubled." "Untroubled," said Purbright, settling into an armchair with the poise of a man who intends to remain unnoticed. "Though it seems one cannot traverse Flaxborough without encountering careful judgment." The rector's lips twitched in the faintest acknowledgment of truth. "Indeed. And judgment, once applied, has a curious habit of returning to its author." The subject of the anonymous letters emerged swiftly, though indirectly. The rector poured tea, avoiding the discussion as if mere preparation of the beverage might deflect the conversation from uncomfortable speculation. "It appears," he said finally, "that more correspondence has arrived today, delivered in the early hours. They are, of course, unsigned. One could dismiss them as idle moral commentary, yet they carry a precision that is, remarkable. Purbright sipped his tea. Precision and discretion often coexist where talent meets a quiet temperament. One is reminded that virtue is sometimes most persuasive when silent, or at least unseen. Reverend Simcox inclined his head, as though noting the aphorism for future application. It is this discretion, or the appearance thereof, that troubles me. The letters seem tailored to provoke reflection, yet they never reveal the hand behind the ink. Civility, one might say, used as a gentle instrument of interrogation. Purbright allowed a slight smile to appear, dry and imperceptible. In Flaxborough, Inspector, even civility carries consequence. After a pause, the rector gestured toward a small tray of biscuits. You will forgive me if I appear concerned, Inspector. Yet the distribution of these letters, deliberate and yet invisible, has unsettled our committee members more than they care to admit. Unease, said Purbright, is often the measure of effective observation. People rarely recognize discomfort unless it is directed at them personally, or they suspect it might be. The rector stirred his tea absently, eyes following the delicate swirl of liquid in his cup. "And the typist?" he asked softly. "Miss Roper. One cannot help but notice her meticulous attention to detail, her composure, yet one wonders whether she records merely to remember or to influence." Purbright allowed the question to settle like dust on the furniture. Observation is not always neutral, Reverend. Sometimes, by merely noticing, one asserts authority. The act of recording, even silently, can be a quiet form of persuasion. The rector's expression flickered briefly, less of surprise than of recognition. "Precisely. I have long considered her an invaluable aid to parish administration, yet I confess a certain apprehension in imagining what she might record of those in positions of responsibility." The conversation drifted to the committee's recent meeting and the mayor's reception, both events carefully chronicled in the town's unofficial ledger of moral conduct. Reverend Simcox recounted Mrs. Goff's remarks with polite precision, his emphasis on civility slightly masking the unease of recollection. "It is remarkable," said Purbright, "how a gathering of polite people can generate a tension that is almost tangible, even without overt disagreement. Every glance, every hesitation becomes a statement in itself." "Yes," said the rector, "and yet the observers are rarely those we expect. I suspect Miss Roper noticed more than anyone else present, though outwardly she was entirely discreet." Purbright nodded. Discretion is a form of control, and control, in the hands of a disciplined observer, is seldom neutral. One cannot help but wonder whether letters, notes, and observations are directed at the town or at those who presume to measure it. The rector sipped his tea thoughtfully. "A town under quiet scrutiny is a different creature altogether, Inspector. People act differently when they know they are observed, even indirectly." The discussion took a subtler turn when Reverend Simcox retrieved a letter he had just received and laid it before Purbright. The paper was folded meticulously. The typeface and spacing were consistent with previous correspondence. "You see," he said, "the content is as gentle as it is precise. Advice couched in civility. Yet the marginal notes, tiny pencil marks, suggest a level of engagement beyond mere delivery. The writer anticipates the reader's reaction as if conducting a dialogue through ink and paper." Purbright examined the letter carefully, noting the minute, almost imperceptible smudge near the signature block, the careful folding, and the faint lavender scent. "A deliberate touch," he said softly, as though to mark the letter as both personal and deliberate, while maintaining anonymity. "Yes," said the rector, And therein lies the intrigue. Who observes whom and to what end? Purbright considered the question. In Flaxborough, as he had learned, the answer was rarely straightforward. Observation, reflection, and judgment were woven into daily routines like invisible threads, shaping behavior without ever calling attention to themselves. Later, the rector mentioned the post office deliveries, his words casual yet pointed. "I have noticed a pattern, Inspector. Letters are collected and deposited at specific hours, often coinciding with the town's busiest pedestrian flows. It is as though the writer wishes the letters to be seen, yet never directly observed." "Strategic discretion," Purbright said, tapping his chin lightly. "The typist ensures circulation while preserving anonymity. Each act is measured, each appearance calculated. And yet," the rector added, "there is a subtle encouragement in these letters, a provocation, to reflect perhaps, but also an insistence on moral consideration. The town is gently guided, though none may know by whom." Purbright smiled faintly. "The instrument is invisible, Reverend, yet the effect is unmistakable. Observation, when executed with discipline, becomes a force of its own." As the afternoon waned, a minor incident occurred. The rector's cat, a small and fastidious creature, leapt onto the desk and nudged a folded page toward Purbright. The envelope, unsigned and carefully pressed, bore a pale blue ribbon. Purbright recognized the typist's hallmark immediately. He lifted the envelope, turning it delicately in his hands. Reverend Simcox watched, expression neutral, though a faint tightening around the eyes betrayed mild curiosity. "It appears," said Purbright, "that some letters are delivered not to instruct, but to suggest, a gentle nudge rather than a command. The writer remains invisible, yet asserts influence." The rector nodded. "Indeed, and influence, when invisible, is often the most enduring." Purbright allowed the thought to linger, considering the typist's pattern, her precision, her discretion, her control over observation and information. Every detail, he realized, was deliberate, measured, and designed to shape the town's awareness. Yet one question remained, subtle and insistent. Was the typist recording merely for herself, or was she orchestrating a larger design, a moral experiment in miniature, with Flaxborough as both subject and audience? The envelope remained in Purbright's hand as he rose to leave. The rector poured fresh tea for himself, silently acknowledging the unspoken tension between observation and influence, between civility and scrutiny. Purbright stepped into the rectory's hallway, glancing once at the window above, where he imagined Miss Roper at her desk, poised, disciplined, deliberate. The faint click of the typewriter seemed almost audible in the quiet of his mind. Outside, the town continued its unremarkable rhythms, doors opening and closing, footsteps along the pavement, shutters drawn against the slanting afternoon light. Yet beneath the calm, Purbright sensed the subtle power of unseen scrutiny, the knowledge that every gesture, every hesitation, every letter might be observed, recorded, and measured. And as he departed, he carried with him the envelope, a single, delicate token of both order and mystery, an unspoken challenge to discern the typist's intent and to determine whether Flaxborough was being corrected or merely catalogued. For in that silent observation lay the quietest, most persuasive form of authority. Flaxborough's High Street by mid-afternoon was hushed in that peculiar lull which follows the departure of postmen and the completion of school dismissals. Inspector Purbright walked slowly toward the chemist's corner, noting the precision with which shutters were adjusted and windows polished. The town carried the air of careful maintenance, as if even the cobblestones had been placed to prevent scandal. Miss Roper's upper room window remained closed, curtains drawn against the glare. Yet the shadow of movement behind the pale fabric betrayed life within, a figure seated at a desk, upright, precise, engaged. Purbright lingered opposite the chemist's, observing the room through a faint reflection in the glass of a neighbouring shop. He did not need to strain his eyes. Even the subtle tilt of her head, the occasional pause of her fingers above a sheet of paper, conveyed the meticulous rhythm of her afternoon work. At precisely 2 o'clock, a discreet knock sounded at the chemist's door. The bell above it did not jingle, suggesting familiarity rather than formality. Mr. Dobson appeared briefly, his moustache stiffened in apprehensive civility. "Miss Roper has a visitor, Inspector," he murmured. Purbright inclined his head politely. "Indeed?" "Mr. Briggs, sir, from the council," said Dobson, arrived for his fortnightly consultation. As Briggs entered, Purbright observed the interaction from across the street. The councillor's posture was an interesting mixture of formal authority and tentative deference. Miss Roper rose with calm, unassuming grace and gestured toward a chair. The visitor seated himself, producing a small bundle of papers that he placed on the desk with deliberate precision. The conversation, carried out in tones barely above casual, seemed innocuous. Purbright could discern fragments, Briggs mentioning reports, Miss Roper noting minutes, the occasional polite correction of dates and figures. Yet beneath the civility there was something more, an exchange of subtle observation, the gentle probing of a mind accustomed to discerning nuance. Minutes passed. Purbright noted the habitual way Miss Roper adjusted her papers, straightening each with care, the blue ribbon tied with meticulous exactitude. She asked a question, phrased as a clarification of procedure, yet the slight emphasis on one word, a particular parish committee motion, suggested inquiry rather than mere record-keeping. Briggs nodded, either unaware of the nuance or constrained by propriety from acknowledging it. It was the rhythm of Flaxborough civility made material. Small gestures, cautious phrases, pauses pregnant with unspoken meaning. To the casual observer, the meeting was ordinary. To Purbright, every detail was a potential signpost. At one point, Briggs hesitated before producing a letter. He passed it to Miss Roper with the faintest trace of reluctance. She accepted it without comment, her gloved fingers brushing briefly against the envelope, noting its weight, the curl of the paper, the faint lavender aroma, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable to a practiced observer. Purbright allowed himself a small, private smile. The typist's signature had been left, invisible yet tangible, upon the letter in scent and in texture. The careful marks and measured spacing of the type revealed a mind that insisted upon authority even while maintaining discretion. The conversation shifted to recent council observations and committee reports. Miss Roper's responses were composed and courteous, yet precise. She made no unnecessary movement, offered no unsolicited opinion, and yet managed to assert influence by choosing the precise detail to emphasize. Briggs appeared unruffled, yet Purbright noted a barely perceptible stiffening of the shoulders each time Miss Roper referred to the proprieties of procedure. It was, in effect, a performance. Civility as power, discretion as control. Every gesture, every phrase, every pause was calibrated to assert moral and intellectual authority without appearing to do so. After nearly half an hour, Briggs rose, thanking her in a tone intended to signal polite closure. He departed as quietly as he had arrived, leaving Miss Roper alone with her papers once more. She adjusted the bundles of letters, straightened her desk, and examined the envelopes with the same diligence, as if each were a specimen in a laboratory. Purbright lingered, watching. The rhythm of her movements, almost meditative in its discipline, betrayed neither fatigue nor distraction. Each sheet of paper, each fold of ribbon was part of a ritual of meticulous observation. And yet, behind the mechanical motions, he sensed a calculation, the quiet, deliberate shaping of events and impressions. Mr. Dobson appeared at the door, announcing a visitor of a different sort. Mrs. Goff, whose arrival was heralded by the soft rattle of her walking stick on the polished floorboards. She entered with her habitual combination of civility and imperiousness, nodding to Purbright across the street. Miss Roper rose again, greeting her guest with composed courtesy. The two women spoke briefly about parish events, charitable contributions, and social proprieties, yet, as with the earlier visitor, every word was layered with subtle intention. Miss Roper listened carefully, replying with neutral phrases that nevertheless guided the conversation toward areas of her own choosing. Mrs. Goff's eyes flickered occasionally toward the letters on the desk, noting them perhaps, but unable to decipher their full significance. Purbright's thoughts turned inward. The typist, it seemed, conducted a dual form of correspondence, written letters to the town and carefully mediated conversations with its leading figures. Both were instruments of observation, subtly influencing the balance of attention and perception in Flaxborough. After Mrs. Goff departed, Miss Roper returned to the desk, adjusting the blue ribbons around her letters once more. Purbright noted the faint smudge of powder on one envelope, a trace of talcum or lavender, which marked it as handled, yet anonymous. He reflected on the artistry of the act, the careful balance of visibility and invisibility, influence and discretion. The letters were not merely moral commentary, they were instruments of social calibration, each fold, each scent, each mark chosen to convey authority while remaining untraceable. As the afternoon waned, Purbright allowed himself to observe the final gesture. Miss Roper paused, straightened in her chair, and looked briefly out the window toward the empty street below. The motion was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it conveyed awareness of the wider town, of the network of observation extending beyond her room. She seemed to measure not only the papers before her, but the very town itself. Purbright understood the quiet power of this act. The typist did not merely record, she surveyed, assessed, and indirectly guided behavior. And in that silent measurement lay authority more enduring than public pronouncement. He turned away slowly, noting the reflection of the chemist's window in the glass across the street. The shadowed interior revealed little, yet suggested much, a mind at work, precise, deliberate, and utterly unobserved by the town below. Walking back toward his office, Purbright considered the subtle clues of the day, the visits, the letters, the marks on the envelopes, the pauses and gestures, all constituted a network of influence, quietly imposed and carefully managed. The typist's hand was evident everywhere, yet invisible to all but the most attentive. At the corner, a scrap of paper fluttered across the cobbles, caught briefly by the lamplight before settling into shadow. Purbright retrieved it and examined the faint notation in the margin. Observe, record, reflect. He tucked it into his coat pocket. The instruction, or perhaps the reminder, was at once banal and significant. It suggested method, deliberation, and a mind that measured not only actions but perceptions. And as he walked the remaining distance to his office, he felt the familiar thrill of quiet discovery. In Flaxborough, civility was both shield and instrument, and the typist wielded it with precision. Yet one question remained, subtle and persistent. Was the town being corrected, catalogued, or simply observed? And would anyone, beneath their masks of propriety, ever recognize the hand that guided them so meticulously? Purbright allowed the thought to linger, for the answer, he knew, would arrive only in its own time, quietly, and with the meticulous deliberation of a typist's hand.